William Harper was a man who preferred the quiet life. After decades of working as an engineer in a bustling city, he had finally retired and decided it was time for a change. He packed up his belongings, sold his apartment, and moved to a small suburban neighborhood surrounded by trees, friendly faces, and most importantly, a beautiful lake that shimmered under the sun. The house he chose wasn't flashy or modern. It was simple, cozy, and perfect for someone like William who valued peace above all else. But there was one thing about William that made him stand out from the other residents: his boat. It wasn't a fancy yacht or a speedboat. It was a modest fishing vessel, weathered from years of use, but still sturdy enough to glide across calm waters. To William, the boat was more than just a possession. It was a memory of weekends spent with his late uncle, who had taught him how to fish when he was a boy. His uncle had also left him this house, along with some land nearby, though William hadn't paid much attention to those details at first. All he cared about was starting fresh in a place where he could relax and enjoy nature. When William pulled into the driveway of his new home with the boat hitched to his truck, he didn't think twice about leaving it parked there. After all, it wasn't blocking anything, and he figured he'd find a better spot for it later. But what William didn't know was that this seemingly harmless decision would soon cause a stir among his neighbors. The Homeowners Association, HOA, in this neighborhood was known for its strict rules. Everything from mailbox colors to lawn ornaments had to meet their approval. They prided themselves on keeping the area looking pristine, and they weren't shy about enforcing their standards. So when Margaret Whitmore, the president of the HOA, noticed the boat sitting in William's driveway during her morning walk, she immediately bristled. To her, it was an eyesore, a blot on the otherwise flawless appearance of the neighborhood. Margaret wasted no time. She marched back to her house, sat down at her desk, and drafted a formal letter to William. In it, she politely but firmly demanded that he remove the boat within 72 hours, citing the HOA's guidelines about unsightly vehicles being prohibited in driveways. She signed the letter with flourish, slipped it into an envelope, and hand-delivered it to William's front porch before dinner. William found the letter later that evening. At first, he chuckled. Surely, they couldn't be serious about something as trivial as a boat. But as he read through the letter again, he realized they were completely serious. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a demand backed by the authority of the HOA. Feeling slightly annoyed but not wanting to make waves so early in his stay, William decided to play along for now. He hooked the boat back up to his truck and drove it down to the lake, thinking it might actually be a good idea to store it closer to the water anyway. Little did William know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. While he settled into his new routine, the HOA continued to keep a close eye on him, and unbeknownst to everyone in the neighborhood, William was sitting on a secret that would turn their world upside down, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the lake they loved so dearly. The boat's relocation to the lake didn't bring the peace William had hoped for. In fact, it only made things worse. Margaret Whitmore and her fellow HOA members weren't satisfied with simply getting the boat out of sight. They seemed determined to make William's life as difficult as possible. The moment the boat appeared near the water, complaints began pouring in from neighbors who claimed it was ruining their view. Some even went so far as to say it looked trashy and out of place, despite the fact that it was parked on what everyone assumed was public land. Margaret, ever the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic standards, took the lead once again. She called an emergency HOA meeting to address what she referred to as the boat issue. At the meeting, tempers flared as residents voiced their frustrations. One man complained that the boat blocked his perfect sunset photos, while another woman argued that it made the lake look less inviting. Margaret nodded along, scribbling notes furiously, clearly enjoying her role as the voice of authority. By the end of the meeting, they had drafted yet another letter to William, this time demanding that he move the boat entirely off the premises or face legal action. William received the letter a few days later and shook his head in disbelief. He couldn't understand why everyone was making such a fuss over something so small. Sure, the boat wasn't the sleekest vessel on the lake, but it hardly deserved this level of outrage. Still, William was no stranger to conflict. He'd spent years navigating tough situations in his engineering career, and he decided to take a closer look at the situation before responding. As he sifted through the documents left behind by his late uncle, William stumbled upon something surprising. Among the deeds and titles was a piece of paper that caught his eye. A property map showing not just his house and its surrounding land, but also the entire lake. According to the paperwork, the lake wasn't public property. It belonged to him. His uncle had purchased it decades ago, long before the neighborhood had been developed, and had allowed the community to use it freely out of kindness. But legally speaking, the lake was private, and so were the docks, gazebos, and fishing spots that dotted its edges. At first, William wasn't sure what to do with this information. Part of him wanted to march straight to the HOA meeting and drop the bombshell right then and there. He imagined the looks on their faces when they realized they'd been picking fights with the owner of the very thing they cherished most. But another part of him hesitated. Revealing his ownership would undoubtedly cause chaos, and William wasn't eager to become the center of drama in his quiet new home. Instead, he decided to sit back and observe. He figured he could let the HOA dig themselves deeper into their own hole before revealing his trump card. For now, he played along, sending a polite reply to their latest demand, saying he'd consider moving the boat if they provided him with a reasonable alternative location. This response only fueled Margaret's frustration. She interpreted it as defiance and began rallying the neighbors to escalate their efforts. What none of them realized was that William was biding his time. Every complaint, every snide comment, and every accusatory glare only strengthened his resolve. He started researching local laws and consulting with a lawyer to ensure he understood his rights fully. Meanwhile, the HOA grew increasingly bold, convinced that their numbers gave them the upper hand. They organized petitions, held more meetings, and even discussed imposing fines on William for noncompliance. But unknown to them, William was about to turn the tables in a way they could never have anticipated. While they focused on their campaign against him, he quietly prepared to assert his ownership, not just of the boat, but of the entire lake itself. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just be William's life that changed forever. The entire neighborhood would have to rethink everything they thought they knew about the place they called home. As the HOA's crusade against William intensified, so did his curiosity about the lake and the land surrounding it. Every night after dinner, William would sit at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and pore over the stack of documents he'd inherited from his uncle. The more he read, the clearer it became that his ownership extended far beyond just the house and its immediate backyard. The lake, the shoreline, and even parts of the wooded areas nearby, all of it belonged to him. It was an astonishing discovery, one that left William both amazed and conflicted. He remembered his uncle as a kind, unassuming man who loved nature and valued community. Over the years, he had allowed neighbors to build docks and gazebos along the lake without asking for anything in return. To the residents, the lake felt like a shared treasure, a place where families could gather, fish, and enjoy each other's company. But legally speaking, none of them had any right to be there. William realized that if he wanted to, he could shut down access to the lake entirely, forcing everyone to remove their structures and stay off his property. The thought gave him pause. Was it worth causing such disruption over something as trivial as a boat? Still, William couldn't ignore the injustice of the situation. The same people who now accused him of ruining the neighborhood were benefiting from his family's generosity without even realizing it. And instead of gratitude, all he'd received since moving in was hostility. Margaret Whitmore's letters grew increasingly aggressive, accusing him of being stubborn and selfish. Some neighbors whispered behind his back, calling him difficult and uncooperative. William tried to brush it off, but deep down, it stung. Determined to understand his options, William reached out to a lawyer named Sarah Chen, who specialized in property law. He brought her the deeds, maps, and correspondence from the HOA, laying everything out on her desk. Sarah listened intently, nodding as she flipped through the documents. When she finished reviewing them, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Mr. Harper," she said, "you're sitting on a goldmine here. Not only do you own the lake, but you also have significant leverage over the HOA. Legally, they're trespassing." William nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "But what should I do?" he asked. "I don't want to make enemies, but I can't keep letting them push me around either." Sarah suggested a measured approach. She recommended drafting official notices to inform the HOA and the fishing club of his ownership rights. These notices wouldn't demand immediate action. Instead, they would serve as a wake-up call, giving the residents a chance to reflect on their behavior. If they refused to acknowledge his authority, William could take further steps, up to and including restricting access to the lake. Armed with this advice, William returned home feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, he felt empowered knowing he had the law on his side. On the other hand, he dreaded the fallout that would inevitably follow once the truth came out. He spent the next few days carefully crafting the notices, ensuring they were professional yet firm. Each letter began with a polite greeting before diving into the facts. The lake was private property, and anyone using it without permission was technically violating the law. He concluded by inviting the recipients to discuss the matter further if they wished. When the notices arrived in mailboxes across the neighborhood, the reaction was swift and explosive. Residents gathered in small groups, whispering anxiously about what this meant for their beloved lake. Margaret, predictably, was furious. She called an emergency HOA meeting, slamming her fist on the table as she declared that William was bluffing. "There's no way he owns the lake," she insisted. "This has to be some sort of ploy." But deep down, doubt crept in. Even Margaret couldn't deny the legitimacy of the documents attached to the notices. For the first time since the conflict began, the HOA found themselves on shaky ground. Meanwhile, William watched from afar, waiting patiently to see how they would respond. He knew the real battle was just beginning, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The day after the notices arrived, chaos erupted in the neighborhood. It started with murmurs at the grocery store and escalated into heated debates during morning walks. By the time the HOA meeting was called to order, tensions were running high. Margaret Whitmore stood at the front of the room, her face red and her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, waving one of William's notices in the air like a flag of defiance. "How can he possibly claim ownership of the lake? It's been ours for years." Her words sparked an uproar. Some residents nodded in agreement, while others shouted back that the evidence seemed clear. One man held up his phone, showing pictures of the property map included in the notice. "Look at this," he said, pointing to the bold lines marking William's ownership. "It says right here, he owns the whole thing. The lake, the shoreline, everything." Margaret refused to back down. She accused William of forging documents or twisting the truth to get revenge on the HOA. "He's doing this because we asked him to move his boat," she insisted, glaring at anyone who dared challenge her. But not everyone was convinced. A few members began whispering among themselves, wondering if they'd gone too far in their treatment of William. After all, none of them had ever stopped to consider where the lake actually came from, or who might own it. Amid the commotion, William walked into the meeting unannounced. His sudden appearance silenced the room, every eye turning to him as he stepped forward calmly. Without saying a word, he placed a folder on the table in front of Margaret and opened it. Inside were copies of deeds, maps, and legal certificates proving beyond a doubt that the lake belonged to him. He also included photographs of old letters written by his uncle granting informal permission for neighbors to use the lake over the years. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Margaret stared at the documents, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, she stammered, "Even if Even if this is true, you can't just take away something we've always had. What about our fishing club? What about our families? William crossed his arms and looked around the room. I didn't ask for any of this, he said evenly. All I wanted was to live quietly and enjoy my retirement. Instead, I've been bombarded with demands, accusations, and hostility, all over a boat. Did anyone stop to think about how your actions made me feel? His tone wasn't angry, but it carried a quiet authority that silenced even Margaret. He went on to explain that he had no desire to punish anyone unnecessarily, but he couldn't ignore the fact that decades of misuse and encroachment had gone unchecked. You've treated this lake like it belongs to everyone, he continued. But it doesn't. It belongs to me. And unless you're willing to respect that, I'll have no choice but to enforce my rights. Then came the ultimatum. William proposed two options. Either the HOA could formally apologize for their behavior and work with him to establish fair rules for using the lake, or he would shut down access entirely. This included evicting the fishing club, removing unauthorized docks, and posting signs declaring the area private property. I don't want it to come to that, he added, but the decision is yours. The room erupted again, voices overlapping in panic and disbelief. Some argued that giving in to William's demands would set a dangerous precedent. Others begged Margaret to negotiate, fearing the loss of their cherished weekend tradition. As the debate raged on, William quietly slipped out of the room, leaving the HOA to wrestle with the consequences of their actions. By the end of the meeting, exhaustion had replaced outrage. Margaret reluctantly agreed to draft a formal apology letter, though she did so through gritted teeth. For the first time since the conflict began, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Whether they liked it or not, William Harper was now calling the shots. The fallout from William's ultimatum split the neighborhood in ways no one could have predicted. What had started as a disagreement over a boat quickly turned into a full-blown divide, with residents taking sides like soldiers in a war. On one side were those who supported Margaret Whitmore and the HOA, clinging to the belief that tradition outweighed ownership. They argued that the lake had always been treated as communal property and shouldn't be taken away simply because of technicalities. On the other side were those who felt sympathy for William, recognizing that he had every right to assert his authority after being unfairly targeted by the HOA. Tensions simmered everywhere, in grocery store aisles, at bus stops, even in church pews. Neighbors who had once greeted each other warmly now exchanged icy stares or avoided eye contact altogether. Families found themselves divided too. One couple reportedly spent an entire dinner arguing about whether William was justified in evicting the fishing club if it came to that. Their teenage son sided with William, pointing out that rules existed for a reason, while their daughter insisted that fairness meant letting people keep what they'd grown used to having. By the end of the meal, both parents had headaches, and the kids refused to speak to each other. Margaret, meanwhile, doubled down on her efforts to rally support against William. She organized petition drives, held impromptu meetings in her driveway, and sent daily emails urging residents to stand firm against his unreasonable demands. But cracks began to show in her leadership. A few members of the HOA quietly admitted they admired how calm and composed William had remained throughout the ordeal. Others pointed out that Margaret's aggressive tactics were partly to blame for escalating the conflict in the first place. Some even suggested replacing her as president, though these whispers were quickly shut down when Margaret caught wind of them. Despite the growing unrest, there were moments of levity. One elderly neighbor joked that the lake drama was more entertaining than any TV show, while another quipped that Margaret should start charging admission to her fiery speeches. These small bursts of humor helped ease the tension, but they couldn't mask the underlying unease that had settled over the community. William, for his part, kept a low profile during this time. He continued going about his daily routine, walking his dog, tending to his garden, and occasionally casting a line into the lake. But he noticed the change in atmosphere. People either avoided him entirely or approached him cautiously, trying to gauge where he stood emotionally. Some offered awkward apologies, saying things like, "I never agreed with the HOA," while others tested the waters by asking casual questions about fishing spots or lake conditions. William responded politely but didn't reveal much, preferring to let events unfold naturally. As days passed, it became clear that the HOA lacked a viable plan to counter William's claims. Legal experts consulted by Margaret confirmed that his documents were ironclad, leaving little room for argument. Faced with the reality of losing access to the lake altogether, some members began reconsidering their stance. At a particularly tense meeting, one woman stood up and said, "Maybe we've been looking at this all wrong. Instead of fighting Mr. Harper, why don't we try working with him? If he's willing to compromise, shouldn't we be too?" Her words struck a chord with several attendees, sparking a heated yet productive discussion. For the first time since the conflict began, voices of reason started to emerge. Suggestions ranged from creating a formal lease agreement to organizing volunteer cleanup days to show goodwill. Slowly but surely, a tentative consensus began to form. They would swallow their pride, apologize sincerely, and propose a solution that respected William's ownership while preserving their cherished traditions. By the end of the week, Margaret reluctantly drafted a letter, not just an apology, but also a request to negotiate terms for continued lake access. It wasn't easy for her to admit defeat, but she knew it was the only way to prevent total disaster. As she sealed the envelope and handed it to William, the weight of the past weeks seemed to lift slightly for everyone involved. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, there was hope that peace might be possible. When William received the HOA's letter, he didn't open it right away. He sat on his porch, the envelope resting on the small wooden table beside him. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, the lake shimmered in the fading light, its surface calm and unbothered by the storm of emotions that had swept through the neighborhood. William took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He knew this moment would define not just his relationship with the community, but also how he wanted to live the rest of his life in this place. Finally, he picked up the letter and read it carefully. To his surprise, it was more than just an apology. It was a sincere acknowledgement of their mistakes and a request to work together. Margaret's signature at the bottom looked unusually shaky, as though she'd struggled to write her name. For the first time since the conflict began, William allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were ready to meet him halfway. The next day, William invited a few key members of the HOA to his house for a private meeting. He chose a neutral setting, his backyard patio overlooking the lake, and laid out refreshments to set a friendly tone. When Margaret and the others arrived, they seemed nervous, clutching their notebooks tightly and avoiding direct eye contact. But William greeted them warmly, offering coffee and cookies before getting down to business. "I appreciate your willingness to come here today," William began, his voice steady and calm. "This hasn't been easy for any of us, but I think we have an opportunity to turn things around, for everyone's benefit." He explained that while he valued his ownership rights, he also understood the importance of the lake to the community. "I don't want to take something away that means so much to you," he said. "But moving forward, we need clear guidelines and mutual respect." The group listened intently, some nodding in agreement. One member spoke up hesitantly, asking if William would consider allowing the fishing club to continue operating under certain conditions. William smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I had in mind," he replied. Over the next hour, they hashed out the details of a potential agreement. The HOA proposed paying a nominal annual fee for access to the lake, which William accepted. In return, he agreed to overlook past infractions and permit the existing docks and gazebos to remain, as long as they adhered to environmental regulations. Margaret surprised everyone by chiming in near the end. "We'll make sure the lake is taken care of better than ever," she promised, her voice softer than usual. "And we'll remind everyone that none of this would be possible without your generosity." It was a rare moment of humility from her, and it didn't go unnoticed. By the time the meeting ended, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. William walked his guests to the gate, shaking hands and exchanging polite goodbyes. As he returned to his porch, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight had been exhausting, but it had also taught him something valuable. Standing up for yourself didn't mean shutting others out. Sometimes, it meant finding common ground and building bridges instead. Word of the agreement spread quickly through the neighborhood. While not everyone was thrilled about paying fees or following stricter rules, most residents recognized that it was a fair compromise. The fishing club resumed its activities, albeit with a new emphasis on sustainability and respect for the environment. Volunteers organized cleanup days, and signs were posted reminding visitors to leave no trace behind. For William, the change was profound. Neighbors who had once avoided him now waved hello or stopped to chat during evening walks. Children playing near the lake sometimes called out to him, asking if he'd teach them how to fish someday. Slowly but surely, the tension that had gripped the community began to fade, replaced by a fragile yet hopeful harmony. As William stood by the water one evening, casting his line into the gentle ripples, he reflected on how far things had come. The lake was still his, but now it felt like it belonged to something bigger too. And for the first time in months, he truly felt at home. Months passed, and the neighborhood began to heal. The agreement between William and the HOA proved to be more than just a compromise. It became a turning point for the entire community. What had once been a source of division transformed into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and even friendship. The lake, once at the center of so much conflict, now stood as a symbol of unity. The fishing club thrived under the new guidelines. Members took pride in their role as stewards of the lake, organizing monthly cleanup events and educating newcomers about responsible fishing practices. Children who had never paid attention to the environment before started learning about conservation, thanks to workshops led by older residents. Even Margaret, who had initially resisted William's claims, found herself softening over time. She began attending these events, rolling up her sleeves to help pick up trash or plant native shrubs along the shoreline. Her gruff exterior gave way to a quieter, humbler demeanor, earning her a newfound respect from neighbors she'd alienated during the dispute. William, too, underwent a transformation. No longer seen as the outsider with the boat, he became a beloved figure in the community. People sought him out for advice, not just about the lake but about life in general. His years of experience as an engineer and his calm, thoughtful nature made him a natural mentor. On weekends, families would gather near the water, sharing stories and laughter, while William cast his line nearby. Occasionally, he'd invite curious kids to join him, patiently teaching them how to bait a hook or reel in a catch. These moments brought him joy, filling a void he hadn't realized existed until now. One crisp autumn morning, the HOA hosted a special event to celebrate the lake's renewal. They called it Lake Day, complete with food stalls, live music, and friendly fishing competitions. William was asked to give a short speech, something he hadn't anticipated when he first moved to the neighborhood. Standing on a small stage overlooking the shimmering water, he looked out at the crowd of smiling faces, people who had once been his adversaries, and felt a lump rise in his throat. "I didn't come here looking for trouble," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "All I wanted was a quiet place to call home. But sometimes life has other plans." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This lake taught me that ownership isn't just about control. It's about responsibility. And responsibility means finding ways to share what you have, not just protect it." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, echoing across the water like a promise kept. Afterward, several residents approached William to thank him, not just for his generosity, but for reminding them of the importance of balance and cooperation. Margaret shook his hand firmly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've changed us for the better, William," she admitted quietly. "Thank you." As winter approached, the lake grew still, its surface mirroring the pale gray skies above. William spent many afternoons sitting on his porch, wrapped in a thick sweater, watching the world slow down around him. He thought often about his late uncle, wondering if he'd imagined any of this when he first purchased the land all those years ago. Somehow, William doubted it. This story was uniquely his, a chapter written through patience, resilience, and a willingness to see beyond anger. By spring, the neighborhood had fully embraced its second chance. New signs were installed along the shore, bearing messages like "Respect our lake" and "Leave only footprints." Families picnicked under the trees, couples strolled hand in hand along the paths, and children splashed happily in the shallows. William watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing he played a part in creating something lasting. On one particularly sunny afternoon, as he sat by the water with his fishing rod in hand, a young boy approached him shyly. "Mr. Harper," the child asked, clutching the tattered notebook, "can you teach me how to fish?" William smiled, setting aside his rod. "Of course," he said, motioning for the boy to sit beside him. As they talked and laughed together, the past struggles seemed to fade further into memory. For William, this was the true reward. Not ownership, not victory, but connection. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, he knew he'd finally found exactly where he belonged.